In May 2012, in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Montana, 12-year-old Autumn Hale lived a life that looked ordinary from a distance. She attended middle school, followed the same routines as everyone else her age, and shared a modest home with her parents, Grant and Marilyn Hale. Yet from the time she could form memories, one detail had quietly defined her world. A thick scar stretched across her left cheek, pale pink against fair skin, impossible to ignore no matter how much she wished it would fade into the background of her life. For years, she had been told the same story. When she was 2 years old, their family home caught fire in the middle of the night. Grant and Marilyn had survived. Autumn had survived. The flames had taken everything else, including a part of her face that would never look the same again. The scar, she was reminded often, was proof that she had been saved. It was a reminder of how close they had come to losing her. But to Autumn, the scar felt less like a miracle and more like a sentence she had never agreed to serve. Middle school in a rural Montana town did not leave much room for differences. Classmates stared longer than they should. Some whispered. A few laughed outright. Social media amplified what hallways began. Photos were cropped carefully. Angles were calculated. Silence became a shield. Autumn learned early how to shrink parts of herself to make others comfortable. On the last Saturday of May, she had a dermatology appointment in Billings, part of a routine that had existed for as long as she could remember. Topical creams, checkups, slow progress measured in tiny increments. That morning, before leaving, she raised the subject she had been thinking about for months. She wanted something faster, something definitive. Cosmetic surgery was no longer rare. Girls her age followed influencers who documented dramatic transformations. 18 felt too far away. She wanted her life to begin now. Grant dismissed the idea gently but firmly. Marilyn agreed, saying there was no rush and no reason to change what was already beautiful. Autumn heard the words but felt none of their comfort. Then something shifted. Marilyn, reading the local newspaper at the kitchen table, stopped abruptly. Her expression changed in a way Autumn had never seen before. Not confusion, not concern, something closer to alarm. The paper was folded quickly and removed from sight. The conversation ended there. Autumn noticed. Grant changed the subject. Marilyn spoke about the time of the appointment. The moment passed, but it did not disappear. It lodged itself in Autumn's mind like a splinter. The drive to Billings followed the usual route. The appointment was scheduled for early afternoon. Near the clinic, a newsstand displayed copies of the same local paper Marilyn had been reading that morning. Autumn hesitated only briefly before purchasing one. If there was something in those pages strong enough to unsettle her mother, she intended to find out what it was. Inside the waiting room, she turned the pages without much interest at first. Local politics, a feature on ranching permits, community fundraiser, nothing extraordinary. Then she reached the section devoted to missing persons. In the lower corner of the page was a photograph. A 2-year-old girl with bright red hair. Freckles scattered lightly across her nose. Wide green eyes. The resemblance was immediate and impossible to dismiss. The child in the photo was identified as Willow Mercer. According to the article, she had disappeared from a childcare facility in Idaho 10 years earlier. The description listed her age at the time of disappearance. 2 years old. The year was 2002. Autumn was 12 in 2012. The math aligned too perfectly. The photo showed a face without scars. Smooth skin. No visible marks. But the structure was the same. The shape of the eyebrows. The tilt of the eyes. The curve of the jawline. Autumn felt as if she were staring at an earlier version of herself, preserved in print. A quiet unease replaced her initial curiosity. The dermatology appointment proceeded as it always had. The physician reviewed her records, noted gradual improvement, and recommended continuing the prescribed topical treatment. Autumn asked a question she had never considered before. If she had been in a house fire severe enough to leave a permanent scar on her face, why were there no burn marks anywhere else? Why only the cheek? The physician acknowledged that such cases were unusual. Possible but unusual. He did not have access to the original incident details. He relied on what her parents had reported years earlier. The response did not settle her mind. On the bus ride home, Autumn reread the missing persons article. Willow Mercer had vanished in 2002 from a licensed childcare residence in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The investigation had stalled. A contact number was printed below the notice, separate from law enforcement, listed under the name Rowan Mercer. Autumn saved the number into her phone without fully understanding why. By late afternoon, the familiarity of Cedar Ridge felt different. Every mile marker seemed to carry new weight. If Willow had been 2 in 2002, and Autumn had been 2 in 2002, then the timeline of the house fire required scrutiny. She tried to recall stories of that night, specific details, dates, addresses, photographs from before age 3. She could not remember seeing any. When she returned home, Grant asked about the appointment. Marilyn avoided eye contact longer than usual. Autumn studied both of them with a new awareness. The scar that had defined her childhood no longer felt like evidence of survival. It felt like a question waiting for an answer. That evening, Autumn understood something with unsettling clarity. Whatever Marilyn had seen in that newspaper had frightened her. And whatever it was connected to the girl named Willow Mercer. For the first time in her life, Autumn suspected that the story she had grown up believing might not be the truth at all. Autumn did not sleep well that night. The image of Willow Mercer refused to fade. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph printed in black and white on cheap newsprint. A 2-year-old with bright red hair and unmarked skin, frozen in time in the year 2002. The date beneath the article replayed in her mind with relentless precision. 10 years. Exactly 10 years. On Sunday morning, she retrieved the newspaper from her backpack and read the missing persons notice again, this time with deliberate focus. Willow Mercer had vanished from a licensed childcare residence in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The article mentioned an ongoing private effort to keep the case alive. The contact listed was Rowan Mercer, identified as Willow's older sister. There was no mention of parents. No explanation beyond the original disappearance. Just a brief summary and a plea for information. Autumn began comparing details methodically. Age at disappearance, 2. Year 2002. Hair color, red. Eye color, green. Height at the time, within normal range for a toddler. She mentally overlaid that description onto the version of herself she had seen in medical photos at the dermatology clinic. The resemblance extended beyond coincidence. The timeline pressed harder. If she had been 2 in 2002, then the supposed house fire must also have occurred in 2002. She tried to remember the story her parents had told her. It had never included a specific address, never included a date. It had always been framed vaguely, as something that happened when you were very little. There were no old insurance documents displayed, no faded family albums from a house that no longer existed. There were only photographs beginning at age 3. That detail now stood out with unsettling clarity. At breakfast, Autumn studied Grant and Marilyn more carefully than ever before. She listened to the rhythm of their explanations about mundane topics. She noticed how quickly Marilyn redirected conversation when anything approached the subject of the previous day's newspaper. Grant seemed unusually alert, as if anticipating a question that might surface at any moment. Autumn did not ask one. Instead, she chose silence. Later that afternoon, she reviewed the saved contact on her phone. Rowan Mercer. A Montana area code was not listed. The number originated from Idaho. That fact tightened something in her chest. The article had not been placed by law enforcement. It had been placed by someone who had not given up. The urge to send a message intensified. But before she acted, she needed to think clearly. She searched online for any archived information about the Willow Mercer case. Results were limited but consistent. A missing child report filed in 2002. A child care residence temporarily investigated. No arrests made. The case classified as unresolved. There were brief mentions of a suspected trafficking operation operating in parts of Idaho and eastern Washington during the early 2000s. The articles were old and sparse, but the pattern was undeniable. Autumn felt a quiet shift inside her. The scar on her face had always been framed as evidence of a domestic accident, a tragic but isolated event. Now another possibility formed, darker and more complex. What if the scar was not from a house fire? What if it was from something else entirely? Something that had happened before she became Autumn Hale? By late afternoon, the emotional weight of the discovery began to surface in other parts of her life. On her way home from a nearby convenience store, a small group of teenagers from another school district recognized her from the bus route. Their whispers were not subtle. Their comments were familiar. The scar became the center of attention once again. This time, something inside her reacted differently. The humiliation felt secondary to a growing urgency. The scar was no longer just a target for cruelty. It was potentially a clue. When Grant arrived and escorted her home, the focus shifted to concern about the encounter. Marilyn expressed distress about how unfair it was that people judged her daughter. Autumn listened without fully engaging. The conversation felt detached from the deeper storm building beneath the surface. At dinner, she mentioned that the doctor had reviewed images from when she was 3 years old. She pointed out that those were the earliest records available. The reaction was immediate. Grant asked what the physician had said about progress. Marilyn's attention fixed sharply on the mention of photographs. Autumn noticed the tension. It was not fear about medical treatment. It was fear about documentation. The pattern continued. When Autumn casually referenced the newspaper article, Marilyn interrupted with unusual intensity. The insistence that some things were not appropriate for children her age felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Autumn understood something crucial in that moment. Her parents were not afraid of the world. They were afraid of information. That realization settled into her with chilling precision. That night, alone in her room, she opened the contact again. Rowan Mercer. 10 years of searching. 10 years of unanswered questions. If Willow Mercer had vanished in 2002, and if Autumn Hale had appeared in Montana around the same time, then someone had changed the narrative. The decision formed slowly but firmly. Autumn drafted a short message introducing herself. She did not accuse anyone. She did not explain her suspicions. She simply stated that she had read the notice about Willow Mercer and felt compelled to reach out. Her thumb hovered over the screen longer than she expected. Sending that message would cross a line she could not uncross. It would mean acknowledging that the foundation of her life might be unstable. It would mean inviting strangers into a story she had barely begun to understand herself. But doing nothing felt worse. The truth, whatever it was, had already begun pressing against the walls of her identity. Autumn sent the message. Almost immediately, regret surfaced. What if this was irrational? What if she was projecting similarity where none existed? What if she was about to embarrass herself or cause unnecessary pain to a family that had already suffered enough? She placed the phone face down on her desk and waited. Across the house, she could hear the low hum of her parents' evening routine. Everything sounded normal, predictable, safe. And yet, for the first time in 12 years, Autumn felt as though she were standing at the edge of something irreversible. The story of the house fire no longer felt complete. The photograph of Willow Mercer no longer felt like coincidence. And somewhere in Idaho, someone named Rowan Mercer had spent a decade refusing to let her sister be forgotten. Autumn did not yet know what the response to her message would be, but she understood that whatever came next would change the direction of her life permanently. By Monday afternoon in May 2012, Autumn understood that silence inside her own home had become more revealing than any confession. The message she had sent to Rowan Mercer remained unanswered throughout the night and into the next morning. The absence of a reply tightened the tension instead of easing it. Every vibration from her phone triggered a surge of anticipation that quickly collapsed into disappointment. She told herself that adults had jobs, responsibilities, reasons to respond late. Still, the waiting magnified every doubt she carried. At school, the day unfolded with its usual rhythms, but Autumn moved through it differently. She paid attention to how easily other students referenced childhood memories, preschool teachers, first apartments, early family vacations. She realized that whenever conversations drifted toward life before kindergarten, she relied entirely on stories told by Grant and Marilyn. She possessed no independent memories of the house fire, no sensory recall, no fragments, just a narrative repeated often enough to feel real. After school, she reread the missing persons article again. This time she focused on the name of the childcare facility in Idaho. A quick search confirmed it had closed in late 2002, following an investigation into irregularities in staff background checks. The case had received brief regional coverage at the time but faded quickly from public attention. Autumn felt a quiet, methodical resolve take shape. That evening, when she returned home, Grant asked whether she had homework. Marilyn mentioned dinner plans for the week. Their tone was normal, almost exaggeratedly calm. Autumn watched for signs. Any hint that they knew about the message she had sent. Nothing surfaced. Later that night, her phone vibrated. A reply. Her heart accelerated before she even read it. The message was concise. Rowan Mercer identified herself as Willow's older sister. She asked who Autumn was and how she had come across the article. There was no accusation, no hostility, only a steady, restrained urgency. Autumn read the message multiple times before responding. She chose her words carefully. She explained that she lived in Montana, that she was 12 years old, that she had red hair and green eyes, that she had read the article by chance. She did not yet mention her suspicions directly. Rowan's response came faster this time. She asked for a photo. Autumn hesitated. Sharing an image felt like crossing into irreversible territory. But the resemblance had been undeniable. If she refused, she would always wonder. She sent a recent school portrait. Minutes passed. Then another message arrived. Rowan wrote that the resemblance was overwhelming. She asked Autumn's exact birth date. Autumn typed it without thinking, May 2000. The reply came after a longer pause. Willow Mercer had been born in May 2000. The timing aligned exactly. Autumn felt the air inside her chest compress. Rowan explained that Willow had been placed in the childcare facility after both girls were abandoned as toddlers. There had been no confirmed biological relatives at the time. Rowan, who was 8 years old in 2002, remembered her younger sister vividly. She remembered the red hair, the small gap between her front teeth, the birthmark near her collarbone. Autumn's fingers hovered over the keyboard again. She did not have a birthmark near her collarbone, but she did have a scar on her face. Instead of answering immediately, Autumn switched screens and searched through older medical photos saved on her laptop. She studied her reflection carefully. There were no other visible marks beyond the scar on her cheek. She returned to the message thread. Rowan asked a final question. Did Autumn have any scars or distinguishing marks that could explain a dramatic change in appearance? Autumn's stomach tightened. She described the scar on her left cheek. She repeated the story she had always been told about the house fire. The reply from Rowan was slower this time. When it came, it contained information that destabilized everything. There had been a warehouse fire connected to the trafficking investigation in late 2002. Authorities believed several children were moved through unofficial placements before law enforcement intervened. The details were incomplete. Many records were lost or sealed. But Rowan had spent years piecing together fragments. She had never believed her sister simply disappeared without trace. Autumn reread the message again and again. A warehouse fire, not a house fire. The language was similar enough to confuse a child, different enough to reveal deliberate distortion. Autumn's mind moved quickly through the implications. If Grant and Marilyn had not rescued her from their own home, then where had she come from? If there had been no family house in Montana that burned down in 2002, then what had replaced it in official documents? She searched online for property records tied to her family's name prior to 2003. Nothing appeared before their purchase of their current Cedar Ridge home in early 2003. The pattern sharpened. At dinner, she tested the timeline gently. She asked what city their old house had been in before the fire. Grant answered vaguely, referencing a place outside Helena. Marilyn changed the subject before further specifics emerged. Autumn did not challenge them directly. Instead, she stored the inconsistency. Later that night, Rowan sent another message. She wrote that she had been placing newspaper notices every year on Willow's birthday since turning 18. She worked 2 jobs to afford them. She never stopped believing that her sister was alive. Autumn felt something unfamiliar rise within her. It was not fear. It was recognition. Someone had been searching for her for 10 years. The narrative of abandonment and isolation that she had quietly accepted began to unravel. Her identity no longer felt singular, felt layered. Before going to bed, Rowan asked if Autumn would consider speaking to law enforcement or consenting to a DNA comparison. She made no demands, only emphasized that confirmation could clarify the truth for both of them. Autumn stared at the message for a long time. Turning this into an official matter would shatter the life she knew. It would involve police reports, investigations, legal consequences. It would force Grant and Marilyn into explanations they clearly did not want to give. But silence would preserve a lie. Autumn typed a simple response. She was willing to find out the truth. Across the house, her parents continued their evening routine as though nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted. The scar that once symbolized survival now represented a missing chapter. The house fire story no longer held weight. The name Autumn Hale began to feel fragile. In Idaho, Rowan Mercer waited with guarded hope. In Montana, a 12-year-old girl stood at the edge of a revelation that would demand more courage than she had ever been asked to summon. The message thread remained open late into the night. And for the first time since she could remember, Autumn felt certain of one thing. Her life had not begun the way she had been told. Tuesday arrived with a tension that felt constant and unspoken. Autumn carried her phone everywhere, aware that every message from Rowan shifted the ground beneath her. Overnight, Rowan had sent additional details, dates from the original investigation, a scanned copy of a missing child report filed in Idaho in late 2002, and a brief note explaining that she had never stopped believing her sister had been taken rather than lost. Autumn read the documents before school, absorbing every line with deliberate focus. The report referenced a suspected trafficking network operating across Idaho and eastern Washington in the early 2000s. It mentioned a warehouse fire that disrupted part of the operation. Several children were recovered. Others were never accounted for. Willow Mercer remained listed as unresolved. Autumn's birth year, 2000, aligned perfectly. The timeline narrowed further. After school, she returned home with a clearer understanding of what she needed to do next. Avoid confrontation. Observe. Confirm inconsistencies. At dinner, she asked about the insurance claim from the alleged house fire. She framed the question casually, suggesting that a school project required a story about overcoming hardship. Grant hesitated before answering. He referenced paperwork that had been lost in the chaos. Marilyn added that they had moved quickly after the fire and preferred not to revisit painful memories. The vagueness no longer felt protective. It felt constructed. That evening, Rowan sent another message asking whether Autumn had told her parents about contacting her. Autumn responded truthfully, no. Rowan replied that she intended to speak with Idaho State Police the next morning. She would present the new information and request guidance on next steps. She asked whether Autumn would be willing to confirm her location and identity if law enforcement reached out. Autumn stared at the screen for a long time. This would escalate everything. She responded that she was willing. The following day, something in her parents' behavior shifted. Grant arrived home earlier than usual. Marilyn seemed unusually attentive, asking more questions about school than normal. Their conversations overlapped, as if rehearsed. Autumn sensed that they knew something had changed, even if they did not yet know the details. Late Wednesday afternoon, Rowan sent a short message. She had spoken with Idaho authorities. Because the potential location involved Montana, local law enforcement would likely be notified. Rowan emphasized that no action would occur without careful verification. She assured Autumn that her safety was the priority. The word safety lingered. Autumn closed the message and considered the risk. If police contacted Grant and Marilyn before she was prepared, the reaction could be unpredictable. She replayed every subtle sign from the previous days. The newspaper incident, the urgency with which the paper had been removed, the way Grant's tone had shifted whenever she asked about the past. That night, while reviewing older documents stored in a desk drawer, Autumn discovered something she had not seen before, a copy of her amended birth certificate. The document listed Cedar Ridge, Montana, as her birthplace in May 2000. The registration date, however, was early 2003, 3 years after her supposed birth. The discrepancy was undeniable. She photographed the document and sent it to Rowan. Rowan responded quickly. The delayed registration suggested adoption or legal amendment. Rowan asked whether Autumn had ever seen formal adoption records. Autumn had not. Within hours, another message arrived from Rowan. Idaho State Police had requested that Rowan provide the photo Autumn had sent earlier. They wanted to compare it to archived images from 2002. A potential match would prompt coordination with Montana authorities. Autumn felt the timeline accelerating. By Thursday afternoon, the house in Cedar Ridge no longer felt stable. Grant and Marilyn watched her more closely. Marilyn asked twice whether Autumn had been using social media more than usual. Grant mentioned that people online can be dangerous. The emphasis was subtle but deliberate. Autumn denied nothing. She offered minimal responses and waited. That evening, Rowan sent a message marked urgent. An investigator from Idaho had located archived surveillance stills from the 2002 warehouse fire connected to the trafficking case. One image showed a red-haired toddler being carried from the scene. The face was partially obscured but visible enough to confirm severe facial burns. Autumn read the description repeatedly. A warehouse fire, not a family home. Rowan explained that if Autumn was indeed Willow Mercer, then the narrative of a domestic house fire in Montana would be fabricated. The implications were severe. Before Autumn could respond, she heard her name called from downstairs. Grant and Marilyn stood in the living room. The local newspaper lay on the coffee table. The same paper from Saturday. The missing persons article had been circled. Grant's expression was not confused. It was alarmed. He asked directly whether Autumn had contacted anyone about the article. The tone was measured but strained. Marilyn's composure appeared fragile, her words overlapping as she insisted that the internet was full of misinformation. Autumn did not confess, but the tension in the room confirmed that they were aware of something. Grant mentioned that families sometimes misinterpret coincidences. He emphasized that Autumn was their daughter, that the house fire story was painful but true. Marilyn added that digging into the past could attract dangerous attention. The word dangerous surfaced again. Later that night, Autumn received a final message from Rowan for the day. Idaho authorities intended to contact Montana officials within 48 hours. Rowan advised Autumn to remain cautious but reassured her that any legal steps would be coordinated carefully. Autumn's mind raced through possibilities. If police arrived unannounced, how would Grant and Marilyn respond? Would they cooperate? Would they deny everything? Would they attempt to prevent further investigation? The silence inside the house felt heavier than before. Friday morning, Grant announced that he would be taking the day off work. Marilyn canceled a scheduled appointment. Their justification centered around family time. Autumn understood the shift instantly. They were tightening control. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A new message from Rowan. Idaho State Police had officially opened a preliminary review based on the resemblance and documentation irregularities. Montana authorities would be notified soon. Autumn looked up from her screen. Grant was watching her. The awareness between them felt sharp and immediate. The next move would determine everything. And for the first time since discovering the article, Autumn sensed that her parents were no longer simply nervous. They were afraid. Friday evening arrived with a deliberate calm that felt constructed rather than natural. Grant had remained home throughout the day, citing vague scheduling conflicts. Marilyn moved through the house with unusual attentiveness, checking in on Autumn repeatedly. asking whether she needed help with homework or wanted to watch a movie together. The effort to restore normalcy felt excessive. Autumn sensed that the balance of control was shifting. Late that afternoon, she informed them that she planned to spend the night at a friend's house. The request was not unusual. Sleepovers were common, especially before long weekends. Grant paused longer than necessary before responding. Marilyn suggested that perhaps it would be better to stay home, that family time had been rare lately. Autumn insisted. The atmosphere tightened. Grant eventually agreed to drive her. Marilyn offered her a glass of warm water while she packed a small overnight bag. The gesture felt familiar and routine, but something about the timing unsettled her. She drank without comment. Within minutes of getting into the car, fatigue began to settle over her in a way that felt disproportionate to the day. It was not the gradual tiredness of a long week. It was immediate, heavy, disorienting. The route did not feel right. She recognized the first few turns. Then the roads changed. Streetlights thinned. Landmarks disappeared. Autumn attempted to focus, to remain alert, to question the direction. Words formed but did not reach full clarity. The weight pressing against her awareness intensified. By the time she understood that this was not the route to her friend's home, her thoughts had already begun to fragment. Darkness followed quickly. When consciousness returned, it came in layers. The first sensation was confusion. The second was recognition that she was not where she was supposed to be. Grant and Marilyn were present. Their expressions were controlled but strained. The explanation came swiftly. They had decided to take a short family trip just to spend time together after a stressful week. They claimed she had fallen asleep on the drive and they had not wanted to wake her. Autumn's mind cleared faster than they expected. She remembered the water. She remembered the altered route. She remembered the rising fear before everything went silent. The realization arrived without hesitation. She had been drugged. The accusation surfaced internally first, then aloud. Grant denied it. Marilyn insisted it was imagination, that exhaustion and stress could explain everything. Their words sounded rehearsed. Autumn referenced the newspaper article directly. She referenced Willow Mercer. She referenced the messages exchanged with Rowan. The pretense collapsed. Grant acknowledged that they were aware she had seen the article. He admitted that they feared misunderstanding. He claimed that the internet often created dangerous illusions. Autumn pushed further. Why had they altered the route? Why had she woken up somewhere unfamiliar? Why did the birth certificate show delayed registration? The answers no longer circled around denial. They shifted toward containment. Grant stated that some truths could destroy families unnecessarily. Marilyn argued that reopening old wounds could invite law enforcement into private matters that were resolved long ago. Their tone carried urgency now, not calm reassurance. Autumn understood that they were not trying to convince her anymore. They were trying to control the situation. She stated clearly that she intended to speak with police. She referenced Rowan's communication with Idaho authorities. She mentioned that Montana officials would likely be contacted soon. Grant's composure fractured. He acknowledged that contacting law enforcement would complicate everything. He insisted that if authorities intervened, Autumn could be placed into state custody while records were reviewed. He warned that the foster system was unpredictable and impersonal. He framed the narrative as protection. Marilyn's voice shifted from defensive to pleading. She emphasized that they had loved her, raised her, provided stability. She spoke about sacrifice, about how families are built by commitment rather than paperwork. Autumn listened, but something fundamental had changed. Love did not erase the fact that her identity might have been altered illegally. Protection did not justify withholding truth for a decade. The conversation turned toward confession. Grant admitted that they had not been able to have children. Years of unsuccessful medical treatment had left them emotionally exhausted. Through a private intermediary, they were introduced to a network offering facilitated placements. He described it as an informal adoption process. He admitted that paperwork had been expedited. Marilyn added details carefully, framing the events as desperate decisions rather than criminal acts. They claimed that they had been told the child was abandoned and unclaimed. They insisted that no one had come forward in the early months. Autumn referenced the warehouse fire. Grant hesitated. He acknowledged that there had been an incident connected to the network. He claimed that when they first saw her, she had been injured. He described severe burns to the face. He stated that they had taken her in to save her from further harm. The house fire narrative dissolved. In its place stood something far more complex. There had been no burning family home in Montana. There had been a warehouse fire in Idaho in late 2002 connected to an illegal trafficking operation. Autumn Willow had been present. Grant and Marilyn had removed her from that environment and transported her across state lines. New documents were created. A new identity established. The name Willow Mercer disappeared. Autumn Hale emerged. The justification centered around rescue. They claimed that without their intervention, she might have been lost within the system. They insisted that they had given her safety, education, opportunity. Autumn responded with clarity. Safety built on false identity was not safety. Education built on deception was not stability. Opportunity built on erased history was not protection. The weight of 10 years pressed against the confined space between them. Grant's tone hardened when she repeated her intention to involve law enforcement. He warned again about foster care, about bureaucratic delays, about losing everything familiar. He framed her potential removal as catastrophic. Autumn countered that remaining silent would mean accepting a lie. Marilyn's composure cracked. She admitted fear that once the truth surfaced, they would lose her permanently. Fear that the bond they had built would be dismissed as criminal rather than parental. Autumn acknowledged the years of care. She acknowledged birthdays, school events, medical appointments. She did not deny that they had raised her, but she could no longer ignore the missing pieces. Her phone vibrated unexpectedly in her pocket. A new message from Rowan. The text was brief but decisive. Idaho State Police had officially notified Montana authorities. A preliminary contact could occur within hours. Autumn looked up. Grant saw the shift in her expression. He understood. The situation was no longer hypothetical. The silence that followed carried a new edge. They had brought her here to isolate her from external contact. They had underestimated her resolve. The next step would determine whether the truth emerged under controlled circumstances or under accusation. Autumn felt the clarity settle. Whatever happened next, the story of a house fire in Montana was over. And the story of Willow Mercer was about to move beyond private confession into public consequence. Grant stopped attempting to soften the truth once he understood that silence would no longer contain it. The explanation shifted from vague justifications to structured admissions. The version of events he and Marilyn had repeated for 10 years began to dissolve under the weight of specifics. In late 2002, they had been emotionally exhausted and financially strained from years of unsuccessful fertility treatments. Traditional adoption channels had been slow, heavily regulated, and uncertain. Through a private referral, they were introduced to intermediaries who promised expedited placements. The arrangement was framed as discreet and efficient. They were told that some children in temporary care facilities would otherwise be lost in bureaucratic delays. They were assured that paperwork would be managed quietly. Grant admitted that the transaction had not involved a licensed agency. He acknowledged that documentation had been processed after the fact. He described it as informal, but the structure he outlined fit the pattern of trafficking rather than adoption. Marilyn filled in the parts he hesitated to say aloud. They had traveled out of state in the fall of 2002. They were taken to a holding property connected to the network. There had been confusion and unrest. Rumors circulated that law enforcement was investigating the operation. In the chaos that followed, a fire broke out in a storage warehouse used by the group. The child they would later rename Autumn had been inside that building. She had suffered burns to the left side of her face. According to Marilyn, the intermediaries discussed abandoning injured children to avoid attracting medical scrutiny. Grant insisted that was the moment they decided to intervene directly. They removed her from the location under the justification that they were preventing further harm. Autumn listened to the narrative without interruption. The language they used attempted to reframe abduction as rescue. They emphasized urgency. They emphasized danger. They emphasized that authorities were closing in and that if they did not act, the child might be lost within the system or returned to unstable circumstances. Autumn asked one question with deliberate clarity. Had they contacted law enforcement at the time? The answer was no. Instead, they relocated back to Montana. They secured falsified documents through the same intermediary network. A delayed birth certificate was filed in early 2003. The warehouse fire in Idaho was reinterpreted privately as a domestic house fire in Montana. The story was simplified, repeated, reinforced until it felt unchallengeable. Grant claimed that the narrative evolved gradually. At first, they intended to correct the record once the situation stabilized. But as months turned into years, the risk of exposure grew. The longer the lie existed, the harder it became to dismantle. Marilyn admitted that they convinced themselves the deception was justified because the child, Autumn, was thriving. She was enrolled in school. She received medical care. She was loved. The absence of contact from any biological relatives reinforced their belief that no one was searching. Autumn referenced Rowan. Marilyn's composure faltered. She admitted that in the early years, she occasionally checked online databases for missing children. She insisted that Willow Mercer's case did not initially receive sustained media attention. The annual newspaper notices began years later, after Rowan turned 18. By then, the Hale family identity was firmly established. Autumn felt the timeline aligning painfully. Rowan would have been 8 when Willow disappeared. That meant she was 18 in 2012, the same year she began placing paid notices consistently. The persistence was not sudden. It was a decade of effort built slowly. Grant shifted the focus back to fear. He argued that contacting law enforcement now would erase everything they had built. He warned that charges could include interstate kidnapping, fraud, and document falsification. He implied that investigators might view Autumn as evidence rather than as a daughter. Autumn recognized the strategy. The appeal was no longer emotional alone. It was practical. It was about consequences. She responded with equal clarity. The legal risk they faced was the direct result of their decisions. Concealing the truth further would only deepen the harm. She acknowledged that they may have prevented additional abuse in 2002, but they had also erased her identity without consent. Grant insisted that she had been 2 years old. Consent was impossible. Autumn countered that honesty had been possible at any point in the 10 years that followed. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything said aloud. Marilyn admitted that they feared losing her if the truth emerged. She confessed that every time the anniversary of the warehouse fire approached, she experienced dread that someone would connect the timelines. She admitted that the newspaper article earlier that week had confirmed her worst fear, that someone was still actively searching. Autumn referenced the moment Marilyn folded the paper abruptly. Marilyn acknowledged it. She had recognized Willow's photograph instantly. She had hoped Autumn would not see it. Grant explained that bringing her to the remote location was meant to create space to have the conversation privately. He denied intent to harm, but did not deny that the water had contained a sedative. He framed it as necessary to avoid confrontation during the drive. The admission settled without resistance. Autumn absorbed it with measured steadiness. They had drugged her to prevent escalation. They had relocated her to isolate her from contact. They had underestimated both her resolve and the speed at which authorities were moving. Her phone vibrated again. Rowan's message was direct. Idaho State Police had confirmed coordination with Montana officials. A preliminary welfare check at the Hale residence was likely within the next 12 hours. Autumn read the message aloud. Grant closed his eyes briefly before responding. He acknowledged that the situation had moved beyond their control. He asked her to consider delaying any formal statements until they could consult an attorney. He suggested that cooperative surrender might protect her from foster placement. Autumn evaluated the options logically. If she returned home voluntarily, officers might arrive while she was present. If she remained isolated, authorities could misinterpret the situation as abduction in progress. Either way, concealment was no longer viable. She stated clearly that she would speak truthfully to any investigator. Marilyn attempted one final appeal. She emphasized birthdays, holidays, school milestones. She spoke about the scar treatments, about sitting in waiting rooms, about advocating for her at parent-teacher conferences. She asked whether those years meant nothing. Autumn responded that they meant everything, and that was precisely why the truth mattered. A relationship built on concealment would collapse eventually. Facing it now offered the only possibility of rebuilding something honest. The dynamic between them shifted from control to inevitability. Grant acknowledged that running would escalate charges. Marilyn agreed that further deception would harm Autumn more than help. They understood that law enforcement contact was imminent. The conversation that had been postponed for a decade had finally occurred. Autumn felt a strange duality inside herself. Grief for the parents who had raised her, anger for the identity taken from her, recognition that both realities could coexist. She sent one final message to Rowan. She confirmed that she was safe. She confirmed that she intended to cooperate with authorities. She confirmed that she now knew the truth. The scar on her face, once framed as a tragic domestic accident, now stood as physical evidence of a larger crime network, of illegal placements, of a child moved across state lines under fabricated documentation. The name Autumn Hale no longer felt secure. The name Willow Mercer no longer felt abstract. Within hours, the private confession inside that isolated space would transform into a public legal matter. The years of concealment had ended, and the consequences, both legal and emotional, were about to begin. The moment the confession ended, the fragile balance inside the camper collapsed into urgency. Grant understood before anyone said it aloud that waiting for officers to arrive at their Cedar Ridge home would not contain the fallout. Marilyn's composure fractured under the weight of inevitability. The decision that followed was not discussed in full sentences. It was made in silence and fear. Grant stated that they needed time to think. He framed it as gathering themselves before facing law enforcement. Marilyn agreed too quickly. Autumn recognized the shift instantly. Cooperation had been replaced by panic. When the knock came at the camper door, it cut through the tension like a blade. A campground manager's voice called out, neutral but alert. The presence of an outsider shattered whatever plan Grant might have been forming. Autumn did not hesitate. The isolation had been deliberate. The arrival of a third party represented the first uncontested opportunity for outside intervention. She moved toward the door before her parents could reposition the narrative. The campground manager saw enough in her expression to understand that something was wrong. Autumn's words came clearly and without embellishment. She stated that she had been brought there without consent. She stated that she believed her identity had been falsified. She stated that law enforcement was already involved. The silence that followed was heavy and irreversible. Grant and Marilyn did not attempt to fabricate a new explanation in front of a stranger. The scale of the accusation, kidnapping, identity fraud, interstate trafficking, was too significant to dismiss casually. Instead, fear took over. In a split second that would later be replayed repeatedly in police reports, they moved past Autumn and disappeared into the wooded area surrounding the campground. The campground manager immediately contacted local authorities. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived. Autumn recounted everything from the beginning of the week. The newspaper article, the resemblance to Willow Mercer, the delayed birth certificate, the confession inside the camper, the sedative in the water, the altered route, the admission of illegal placement in 2002. She spoke without exaggeration and without hesitation. Officers contacted Montana state authorities, who confirmed that Idaho State Police had already initiated coordination earlier that afternoon. The timeline aligned precisely with Rowan's final message. Search units were dispatched into the surrounding area. K-9 teams were requested. The perimeter was secured to prevent further flight. Autumn sat inside the campground office as law enforcement activity intensified around her. She did not cry. She did not second-guess. She understood that what was happening was no longer personal. It was procedural. Within 2 hours, Grant and Marilyn were located attempting to move deeper into the forested terrain. They were detained without physical resistance. Both were transported separately to the local sheriff's department for questioning. Autumn was escorted to the same department in a separate vehicle. An officer assigned to juvenile welfare remained with her at all times. Standard protocol required confirmation of identity and immediate coordination with Child Protective Services. At the station, Autumn provided a formal statement. She repeated the events in chronological order. She clarified that she had not been physically harmed beyond the sedation. She stated that she had initiated contact with Rowan Mercer voluntarily. She provided access to her message thread, which confirmed the escalating communication with Idaho authorities. Investigators examined the delayed birth certificate she had photographed earlier in the week. They requested official copies from county records. Initial database searches revealed irregularities in filing dates and supporting documentation. Autumn's legal name in Montana records was Autumn Hale, registered in early 2003. No hospital record matched a birth in Cedar Ridge in May 2000 under that name. The discrepancy reinforced her statement. Idaho State Police formally entered the investigation before midnight. Officers shared archived case files related to Willow Mercer's disappearance in 2002. Photographs, physical descriptors, and timeline documentation were forwarded electronically to Montana authorities. Grant and Marilyn were questioned separately. Under interrogation, their narratives diverged slightly. Grant emphasized rescue. Marilyn emphasized desperation. Both admitted to participating in an unlicensed placement network. Both acknowledged falsifying documentation. Neither denied transporting a child across state lines in late 2002. The charges began to crystallize quickly. Interstate kidnapping, custodial interference, document fraud, and potential conspiracy tied to a trafficking investigation that had never fully closed. Autumn was informed that she would remain under temporary protective supervision pending identity verification. Child Protective Services initiated emergency placement protocol. Given the complexity of the case, no immediate foster transfer was executed that night. She remained in supervised care at the station's juvenile holding area designated for protective custody, not detention. Around 1:30 a.m., Rowan Mercer was contacted officially by Montana authorities. She was informed that a minor in Montana matched multiple identifiers associated with Willow Mercer. She was asked whether she could travel immediately to assist with identification and DNA confirmation. Rowan confirmed without hesitation. Back in Montana, Autumn sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of what had unfolded in less than 48 hours. Grant and Marilyn were no longer her guardians in the eyes of the state. Their parental authority had been suspended pending investigation. Despite everything, conflicting emotions surfaced. She could not erase 12 years of shared holidays, school milestones, and daily routines. She could not deny that they had raised her, but she also could not ignore that her identity had been constructed without her consent and sustained through deliberate deception. Just before dawn, confirmation arrived that Grant and Marilyn would be formally booked pending arraignment. Bail would be determined after charges were filed. Autumn felt the finality of that transition. The narrative of a house fire in Montana had officially collapsed. The name Autumn Hale was now under legal review. Willow Mercer was no longer a distant possibility printed in a newspaper. She was the center of an interstate criminal investigation. As the early hours of the morning passed, Montana and Idaho authorities coordinated the next steps. DNA testing was scheduled. Temporary guardianship hearings were prepared. The trafficking case file from 2002 was reopened for supplemental review. Autumn understood that this was no longer about speculation or resemblance. It was about verification. By sunrise, the legal system had absorbed the secret that had been hidden for a decade. Grant and Marilyn sat in separate holding areas awaiting formal charges. Autumn remained under protective supervision, awaiting the arrival of the one person who had never stopped searching. And for the first time since the warehouse fire in 2002, The truth about Willow Mercer was no longer contained within silence. Rowan Mercer arrived in Montana before noon. Autumn had not prepared herself for the reality of seeing her. For years, Rowan had existed only as a name beneath a newspaper notice, a steady voice through text messages, a persistent presence refusing to let the past disappear. Now she stood in the same building, registered with law enforcement, escorted into a private interview room where Autumn waited. The resemblance was undeniable. Not identical, 12 years of different lives had shaped them differently, but unmistakable. The same shade of red hair, the same green eyes, the same structure across the cheekbones. Autumn felt something shift inside her that no document or police confirmation could manufacture. Recognition did not require explanation. Rowan spoke carefully, guided by investigators who needed every interaction documented. She confirmed her birth date. She confirmed Willow's. She described growing up in the childcare facility after being abandoned as toddlers. She described how she had taken responsibility for her younger sister even at 8 years old. She described the day Willow vanished, how the facility staff reported confusion, how police arrived too late, how the case grew cold. Autumn listened without interruption. When the technician entered with DNA kits, neither girl hesitated. The swabs were collected efficiently. Results were expedited under emergency authorization due to the active criminal investigation. While waiting for confirmation, Autumn learned more about her early years than she had in her entire life. Rowan explained that they had been placed in state care together. There had been no confirmed biological relatives. They had shared a room, shared toys, shared routines. Rowan remembered Willow's habit of refusing certain foods and her attachment to a stuffed rabbit. She remembered the faint freckles across Willow's nose and the softness in her voice. Autumn did not remember any of it, but she felt the weight of being remembered. Hours later, the results returned. The probability of sibling relation exceeded 99.9%. Autumn Hale ceased to exist in official documentation. Willow Mercer was formally reinstated. The legal implications unfolded rapidly. Child Protective Services initiated a guardianship review. Rowan, now 18 and legally independent, expressed immediate willingness to assume temporary custody pending court approval. She provided employment records, rental agreements, and references. She had anticipated this possibility for years. Montana authorities coordinated with Idaho Child Welfare Services to expedite cross-state placement. Emergency temporary guardianship was granted within 48 hours, contingent upon final hearing review. Meanwhile, Grant and Marilyn were formally charged. Interstate kidnapping, custodial interference, document fraud, conspiracy tied to an unresolved trafficking network. Their arraignment occurred within the week. Bail was set but accompanied by strict no-contact orders. They were prohibited from reaching out to Willow directly or indirectly. Autumn Willow was informed of the legal boundaries clearly and compassionately. The emotional aftermath, however, did not follow legal timelines. As she prepared to relocate to Idaho under Rowan's temporary guardianship, conflicting emotions surfaced in waves. Grant and Marilyn had lied. They had falsified her identity. They had drugged her to prevent disclosure. They had attempted to flee when exposure became imminent. But they had also attended every school conference. They had paid for dermatology treatments. They had celebrated her birthdays. They had built routines and traditions that felt real. Willow did not deny those years. She also did not excuse the deception. Rowan approached the transition with patience rather than pressure. She did not demand immediate sisterhood. She acknowledged the complexity of losing one family while gaining another. She allowed Willow space to process anger, grief, and uncertainty. Within weeks, Willow enrolled in a new school district in Idaho. Counseling services were arranged through state support programs for recovered trafficking victims. The 2002 warehouse fire investigation reopened fully, now with a living witness whose existence confirmed the scale of the operation. Federal authorities became involved. Grant and Marilyn eventually entered plea agreements acknowledging falsified documentation and unlawful interstate transport. The court recognized that they had not physically abused Willow and had provided care, but the severity of identity fraud and kidnapping charges remained substantial. Sentencing reflected both mitigating and aggravating factors. Willow attended one of the hearings. She listened as the court outlined the legal consequences. She heard the acknowledgement that while their actions may have originated in desperation, they had deprived a child of her true identity for a decade. She felt the contradiction settle inside her, love and violation occupying the same space. After the hearing, she chose not to approach them. Closure did not require confrontation. By late 2012, Willow Mercer's name had been restored fully across all legal records. School transcripts were amended. Medical files were updated to reflect the warehouse fire rather than a fictional house fire in Montana. Counseling sessions focused not only on trauma but on identity reconstruction. Rowan adjusted to guardianship with remarkable steadiness. She balanced work and court appearances. She attended every meeting with child services. She learned to navigate the role of sister and legal guardian simultaneously. Willow began reconstructing her own narrative deliberately. She reviewed archived case files from 2002. She read the original missing persons report bearing her name. She studied the photograph printed in newspapers every year on her birthday. She learned that Rowan had spent portions of each paycheck on classified ads long after media attention faded. The scar on her cheek no longer symbolized shame. It symbolized survival. It symbolized the night a warehouse burned and a child endured. It symbolized the fact that someone had chosen not to abandon her search. Life did not return to simplicity. There were court dates. There were therapy sessions. There were awkward introductions explaining why a 17-year-old legal guardian was signing school paperwork. There were moments of grief for the parents who had raised her and moments of gratitude for the sister who had found her. But beneath every complication lay one undeniable truth. Willow was no longer living inside a constructed identity. She was living inside reality, messy, painful, honest. Years later, when people asked about the scar, she no longer offered the story of a house fire in Montana. She offered a version of the truth she felt ready to share. She spoke about resilience. She spoke about complicated love. She spoke about the difference between protection and possession. She learned that identity is not defined solely by who raises you, nor solely by who shares your blood. It is shaped by truth, by accountability, and by the courage to confront what has been hidden. Grant and Marilyn's actions had been born from longing and fear. Rowan's actions had been born from loyalty and persistence. Willow stood at the intersection of both. In the end, what defined her future was not the deception that altered her name, nor the crime that transported her across state lines. It was the choice she made when faced with the truth. She chose transparency over silence. She chose integrity over comfort. She chose to reclaim her story rather than inherit a lie. And in doing so, she proved that while love can begin in flawed places, it only endures when built on honesty. The scar remained, but so did the truth. And the truth, once revealed, became the foundation for a life that could finally belong entirely to her. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence here means more than you may realize. Every story we share is not just about events or characters. It is about real emotions, real struggles, and the strength it takes to face the truth. The lesson from today's story reminds us that truth, no matter how painful, has the power to set us free. Love without honesty cannot fully protect us, and courage often begins with asking difficult questions. Sometimes the path to healing requires confronting uncomfortable realities, but growth only happens when we choose integrity over fear. Identity, family, and belonging are complex, but what truly defines us is our willingness to stand in the light of truth and move forward with strength. If this story touched you in any way, we would be truly grateful for your support. You can help our channel continue sharing meaningful stories simply by pressing the like button, leaving your thoughts and reflections in the comments below, and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who may need encouragement, hope, or a reminder that they are not alone. Thank you again for being here with us today. We look forward to sharing more powerful stories with you soon.